Personality dispositions in the lifespan. Personality psychology. Dr. Michael Botwin, Department of Psychology, California State University, Fresno. Hi, this is Dr. Mike Botwin. Welcome back to Personality Psychology. In this unit, we're going to explore personality through the lifespan. Now, this is a very critical question. How stable are personality characteristics over the lifespan? Well, some things stay the same, some things change, but I always find it interesting. So let's take a look at personality and lifespan research. Jack Block was a University of California, Berkeley personality psychologist who studied people over significant chunks of their life. He gives us one of the best definitions of longitudinal research. Let's look at this. Now, Block says that longitudinal research is the close, comprehensive, systematic, objective, sustained study of individuals over significant portions of their lifespan. Are people behaving relatively the same over the course of their lifespans? Well, the data seems to hold that out, and I'm going to show you some very intriguing stuff in this video lecture. But there are some things that affect everyone, no matter what their personality is, and maybe a major factor in studying people longitudinally. So let's look at a couple of those. And the first one is cohort effects. Now, cohort effects are something I really enjoy talking about. I think they're pretty cool. They're basically the historical things that are happening around a group of people that are being studied longitudinally, or they just happen naturally. So you remember back to high school, where it was really important to be a freshman, sophomore, junior, or senior. It had a big meaning to it. That essentially is a cohort type thing. Each year you moved through high school, you moved to a successive cohort until you graduated. In our school psychology in our educational specialist in school psychology, we have a 3-year program on our campus, and the folks that run that program have set it up as a cohort system. And within that system, students are known as the first-year cohort, second-year cohort, third-year cohort. And they all represent different classes or different experiences that the student has during that year. Starts with basic coursework in school psychology, ends up with an internship in the schools and a project or a thesis. Now let me talk about one of my favorite things going on with cohort effects, and those are historical things, technological things. My grandmother was a young woman during the Depression, and was a frugal person, was an excellent cook, and microwaves came out, and my father bought the first microwave that was in our entire neighborhood. Now you might think that's kind of crazy because microwaves now are common kitchen appliances. But my dad worked for Sears, and one day he got a deal on a microwave, brought it home. I can't tell you how many glasses of water that people watched boil in our microwave, or bags of popcorn my mom had to make so people could watch a demonstration of our microwave, because it was kind of an amazing thing at the time. Now some of us curse out our microwaves because they just aren't fast enough. Well, everyone found this microwave to be a marvelous tool, so my parents decided to buy my grandmother one for Christmas. Now, at the time, your average microwave was very expensive. In fact, my dad's scratch and dent one still cost $500. and that was in probably 1970s dollars. So they bought Grandma one. Grandma took it back to the store because she didn't need the newfangled toy. She had grown up before this kind of technology, one that we now take for granted. And she could just reheat her leftovers in a pot like she always did. Well, when my ex and I moved to California, our new house had a built-in microwave. So we no longer needed our old countertop one, and asked Grandma if she wanted it because we didn't want to move it. And she gladly accepted it because it was her right price for Grandma, free. Well, Grandma became a microwave fiend. And so technology that is either in or not in a cohort might affect people. My children and all of you probably have never been in a home without some kind of high-tech knowledge-y things, like a computer, a tablet, a cell phone. My stepson, for a significant part of his life, didn't have those things around because they weren't around yet. These things happen. Now, major historical events happen, and they may affect an entire generation as well. So let's look at generations, and don't memorize the dates for generation and the ages. This is just kind of to give you an illustration of cohort effects. So here is a slide demonstrating the different generations. Individuals that are aged, 7 to 22 are Generation Z. So some of you are part of Generation Z. If you're not a part of Generation Z, you're probably a millennial. And before millennials were the Generation Xers, then my cohort, the boomers, and then for some reason Gallup puts this group that lived through World War II as the silent group. I would rather call them, as Tom Brokaw has, the greatest generation. This was the generation that lived through World War II, the Cold War, and things like that. That all marked considerably their lifespans and what they did and how they thought. It was just a time where it brought out the best in people in our country to a large degree. The next generation are the boomers. I'm a tail-end boomer. I missed the sexual revolution. I got disco. I feel I got cheated. But you all know stories about hippie-type people who most likely are now your grandparents, and the things that happened during the 1960s that changed the culture of our nation. The civil rights movement, the feminist movement, just to name the two most important ones, at least in my mind. There were also things going on like the Vietnam War. So, the boomers. Then we get the Gen Xers. And here we have a group of Gen Xers, and now people in your generation, whether it's millennial or Z, seem to be always on cell phones. Not calling anybody anymore, but just using cell phones as a piece of modern technology in a small handheld computer. And here are our Generation Z folks. They have all of their hashtags for social media, which has very much exploded now. And you hit certain points for using these things. I am horrible at social media. I hate social media. But other examples of longitudinal effects are the music you listen to. I was watching television the other day, and there were a couple of K-pop bands. totally beyond me. I also just don't get rap and hip hop, because my era was now what we call classic rock, or I call Vlasic for those us that are about to be pickled rock. The Who, the Stones, the Beatles, and all of the variants with those guys. Still will listen to Bob Dylan quite a bit. But we kind of get stuck in that formative period of music that is around in our youth. Cohort effects, important thing. I could talk about them for another hour, but I'm sure that you want me to move on to the rest of this video lecture. Another major thing that you have to think about in terms of studying people through the lifetimes are age-graded transitions. When do you transition to a new role during your life? Now, much longitudinal research is going to talk about this in one of two ways: being on time with your life task, being off time with your life task. And that's compared to your cohort. So, here we have a young man going through driver's training. Most people now go through driver's training at 15 and get their permit, get their licenses at 16. Not everybody does it. All three of my boys didn't get their licenses till they were 18, but my stepdaughter got hers pretty much on her 16th birthday. So there's individual variations there. I think my boys just appreciated having a chauffeur, and my stepdaughter didn't want us around. What can you say? So there are these age-graded transitions that are based on societal laws, and different societies may have different ages. And different ages might be appropriate at different times in different societies. Drinking age. The drinking age in this country pretty much is 21 in all states. In Canada, it's 18. In much of Europe, it's 18. And many, many other parts of the world. I was talking with some of my students the other day who were international students, and we were kind of comparing notes. And it seems like, except for our puritanical country, 18 pretty much is it. Although we did have 18-year-old drinking in this country for a little while. After the Vietnam War, now I was too young to be drafted, and was in high school during the end of the Vietnam War. When I turned 18, two things happened. One, pundits put out there the notion that if you can die for your country, you should be able to have a beer. And so the 21-year-old drinking law went into, or the 18-year-old, drinking law went into effect. And also, I was the first group of 18-year-olds who did not have to register for selective service. Now men have to register for selective service again to get student aid, as all the guys in class know well. Well, this was a disaster when it happened in the 1970s, because many 18-year-olds were now passing alcohol down to younger and younger kids, and the roadways became very dangerous. Lots of people were getting hurt. There were lots of accidents. That's when the group Mothers Against Drunk Driving was formed. So it took the politicians about 3 years to rally and change the drinking law back to 21. Well, little personal side story here. So I turned 18. I got to go out and drink. I turned 21 when the law turned back to 21. My younger brother's 3 years younger than me, so he turned 18 the same year that the law changed back to 21. So he kind of got, let's just use the colloquial word, screwed out of 3 years of being able to go out and having a beer. So we have some of these laws, and I'm sure that you could come up with other things that are laws about certain ages. Right now that I'm looking at the other ends of things, I'm looking at, some people are telling me at 60 some I have to do this, and at 60 this I have to do that, and if I wait till 70 then I get more Social Security. So the age-graded transitions never stop. The next one for me is retirement. Now, age-graded transitions don't have to be legally mandated. In fact, most of them aren't. You do things based on where you're at in your life. So at a certain point, at least in our culture, we go to school, we graduate. Many of us go to college, some of us don't, and get right on the, career track. Sorry. And then a little bit later, after your education is completed, people start thinking about finding a long-term mate and settling down. Now, in my parents' generation, most people were married in their very early 20s, 20, 21, things like that now. I'm sure that if you are 21, 22 now and you go home and tell your mom and dad you're getting married, you're going to give them a heart attack. Although many young people do get married and it's successful. Just making a small joke here. But you get married, and usually you get married because your friends start getting married, and you don't want to be the only guy that's left out of the group getting married. So once you pair bond with someone and you're with them for a little while, and your friends who are also pair bond are kind of settling into married life, they start having kids, you and your partner start having children. So you become parents at about the same time. And then as a parent, you move through your other life task, but you also go through your kids' age-graded transitions. Now, here's the one that's a little biological here in our picture. There's this woman running against the clock because she's worried about being late or off time for getting married. She doesn't want to be the last woman married in her group. For a lot of women, they also talk about the ceiling you have in terms of having your children. And you have to have your children by a certain age biologically. Women can't have children for all of their lives. So women start thinking about that. They think about when is the appropriate time to have a baby. And that varies, but generally you think about having a baby about the same time your friends are having kids. So age-graded transitions can be legally mandated or just kind of the things people are going through as parts of their lives. And we'll come back and talk about some specific research-based examples of this as we go through. A couple of things missed it, sorry. A couple of things we're going to look at are L data. We've talked about the different forms of data in a previous lecture. So longitudinal data naturally focuses on life data. And life data is long-term data about a big chunk of a person's life. Personality psychologists are often looking at two relatively synonymous terms. There's some slight technical details that make them different, but not enough for our discussion. Consistency and stability. Do you tend to do the same type of behaviors, the same form of behaviors over the lifespan? Now, there's been some modern research that has put that into some new definitions that we'll cover shortly. Conley, a lifespan researcher, and we'll talk about some of his work with George Kelly a little later, developed what he called a hierarchy of stability of human psychological characteristics. It's kind of simplistic, but it's interesting to put here, and it fits well. The most stable human psychological characteristic is intelligence. And intelligence actually rises slightly until you hit approximately 25. Now, it's a very shallow upward curve, so you start with a level of intelligence, goes up a little bit. After 25, it starts going down again, but at an extremely shallow curve. Hardly goes down at all, but it does go down somewhat. Don't use that against your parents. They'll smack you. Mine would. Personality traits, the most stable human characteristic, that's second on the list. And finally, things that are very temporally based, like self-esteem, are the least stable of human characteristics. Let's say that you get a good grade in this class. Let's say hypothetically you get an A. I like to see all of my students work hard and get great grades. So let's say you get an A. And semester rolls around, you get access to your grades, and you look and you see you got an A in personality psych. So that, I hope, would make you feel good. But I would rather doubt, in fact, I wouldn't even be offended if 10 years from now you're thinking back to your college experiences and you sit down there and say, yeah, I still feel really great that I got that A in Botwin's class. Our self-esteem's often tied to emotions, and they many times are very tertiary. You can be happy about something, but generally the level of happiness goes away over time. Things like that. Well, let's look at our first longitudinal study. It was done by a social psychologist, and it's not quite personality stuff, but it's the best I can find. Theodore Newcomb was one of the most prominent American social psychologists during his career, which spanned into the 1960s. I believe. I might be wrong on that, social psychologist. Don't kick me for that one. Newcomb did some very creative work during his lifetime. I'm going to take a little break from longitudinal stuff just to tell you the kind of stuff he did. Some of it actually sounds like modern reality shows. He would place a group of individuals who didn't know each other, give them free room and board for a year, and see how they formed a household. Kind of sounds like the old MTV show, doesn't it? Now, after World War II, there were a ton of veterans coming back and using their GI Bills to go to college. In some universities, they have married student housing apartment complexes that are reasonably priced apartments for young married students. And they're pretty rudimentary things. They're kind of like overgrown dorm rooms. But they would build a large number of these. By the time Newcomb moved to the University of Michigan, they were building one of these complexes and just letting people move there. So he got in there and studied how people formed a neighborhood and the social psychology of forming a neighborhood. Just stunning stuff. I just think he was really, really, really an amazingly smart guy. At the University of Michigan, where I did my graduate work, there was, and I imagine still is, a Newcomb lecture that happens regularly in honor of Theodore Newcomb's work, always presenting cutting-edge work in social psychology. But this is longitudinal personality. Let's get back to the one study Newcomb did that I want to highlight for you. And Newcomb did a study that showed how the strong effects of an environment for a very long period of time can change the attitudes of a group of individuals. This was some of Newcomb's first major work. Now, Newcomb's first job was at a place called Bennington College, and he worked there in the late 1930s. I was able to find this picture on the web of 1930s era Bennington College with a group of young women who, if any of them are still surviving, would be well over 100 at this point. But Bennington was a all-women's college. It was kind of like right below the women's Ivy League, the group of schools called the Seven Sisters, be Radcliffe, Wesleyan, schools like that. Well, Newcomb arrived there to start his job as a social psychologist in the late 1930s. And he found it a rather interesting place. First of all, Bennington is in Vermont. I think I actually put Connecticut there by mistake on the caption. Ignore that. And what happened over time is now it's been suburban sprawled over. But in the late 1930s, Bennington was kind of a quiet, very isolated place. You have to remember there were no cell phones. TV hadn't been invented yet. Well, it had been invented, but it wasn't out there. There was radio, but not at really long distances. There was a telephone in the hall of each dorm. People didn't even have their own individual phones. Now, the idea of students even having cars was out there, and the students got to Bennington by train. So, fairly isolated place. There was a one-screen movie theater, and that's about it. So basically, not a whole lot to do at Bennington for either the students or the faculty. So they chose to engage in activities that where they entertained themselves. So they would have clubs. Here is a dance group. It's the Hannah Home Dance Company. They're performing on the lawn, I believe in the quad. If you're a Bennington student or alum and I'm wrong, email me and I'll pop a fix into the lecture. But people had to make their own fun. So they had book discussion groups. They put on plays. They did things. And the faculty interacted with the students. Now, to this day, there is the stereotyped attitude that all us university professor type people are pico commie libs. Our goal as faculty members is to turn you all into little socialists. If you've noticed through my video lecture series, there's lots of subliminal socialist messages. I'm just kidding. Don't go looking for them. Don't get paranoid. I have too much psychology to teach you to worry about politics. But politically, faculty generally are more on the left than the right on average. There are a few conservative faculty people out there. I'm kind of a moderate libertarian. Don't fall into either party, so I get to hate each party equally. Well, the women that came to Bennington College as impressionable freshmen, and remember there were no part-time students then, no online learning, none of this stuff, and so it was kind of a cohort thing. They stayed for 4 years and moved on. Getting a college education pre-World War II was a rare event. Many, many people did not go to college. More people are going to college now than ever. But at the time, pre-World War II, only the rich and very smart went to college. The Bennington women generally came from very old conservative families from the East Coast of the United States. These families were generally very politically conservative. So Newcomb got the idea of measuring their political attitudes and see how they changed from when they entered Bennington to when they left Bennington, and to see if the effects of being in a liberal environment would make these women more liberal. Now, you also have to remember things in terms of cohort effects, historical effects. You're talking about a time pre-World War II. Our country is just starting to get out of the Depression. Franklin Roosevelt is president. There's a considerable amount of social jobs work programs like the National Recovery Act, or the NRA, and those were all considered almost socialist things by some folks. So conservative girls, women, placed in a liberal environment, sure enough, Newcomb found that over time, these women became more liberal by the time they graduated college. But the very interesting thing that Newcomb did is he followed these women up another 20 years by sending them questionnaires. And these women's life paths were kind of interesting. There were two primary groups. The first group of women returned back to their families, to their country club lifestyle. Generally, they reverted back to being conservative. The second group of women tended to move to big East Coast cities, which generally are also stereotyped as liberal. Now, starting in the 1930s, it's the major world event of the 20th century, World War II. We don't get into it until the 1940s, but World War II had already started in Asia with the Japanese invading Korea and China and other places like that. 1939, the Germans invade Poland and then later France. Before that, Mussolini was messing around in North Africa trying to rebuild a Roman Empire. So Pearl Harbor, is attacked. And all of the men, and you have to remember this is still a relatively sexist time, go off to fight the war. Now there's a significant number of women who also serve in the military, but vast numbers of men are taken out of the American workforce and sent overseas to fight the good fight. This left many holes in companies and corporations across this country. And you've all seen the picture of Rosie the Riveter with her arm and bandana on her head, and she's going to help World War II by working for the companies that are building military products. And these were basically blue-collar jobs. My grandmother, not the microwave one, my mom's mom, my other grandmother, to her dying day was proud that she helped build bomb racks for B-24 bombers in a factory outside of Detroit. But the lesser-known story is that many women who were educated, and remember, I've already told you, college education, very rare thing, went to cities like New York to take the white-collar jobs that had been vacated by men going to war. they were highly sought after because they were college educated, and that was a rarity in the 1930s. Many of the women who moved to cities like New York later after the war found husbands and stayed in New York. Newcomb followed these women up over a period of 20 years after they graduated and found out that those women who moved to New York City, liberal city, married liberal men, retained their liberal political attitudes pretty much for the rest of their lives. Now, political attitudes is not personality. No one has done a long-term study based on trying to change people's personalities over the lifespan. That would kind of be unethical. I've often thought it might be cool to study individuals whose personalities have changed because they've been through some kind of cohort-based thing like the military, and see if their personalities significantly change over their lifetimes. I have several friends who are Marines. If you know a United States Marine, you know that there is never a former Marine. Once a Marine, they're always a Marine. And it's a big pride point, and they should have that pride point. It was hard service, and some of them did some very dangerous things. But haven't done that one yet. Maybe you can pick up on it and do it for me. So let's look at personality stuff, because that's what we're supposed to be talking about, right? Here we are going to move on here. Sorry, the slide is not moving. Now the slide moved the wrong way. Okay, here we are. Personality development. And personality development has to do with the continuities, consistencies, and stabilities in which people change over time or stay the same. First thing we want to talk about as a theoretical approach to studying lifespan research is rank order stability. And that's maintaining your individual position within the group. So let's say that you are the most, and I'm going to pick on my favorite trait, extroversion. Extroverted 18-year-old. You're swinging off the chandelier at the party. Are you going to be the most extroverted 90-year-old hustling up the shuffleboard game at the nursing home? Interesting question. Probably true, but you can see you maintain your order in your cohort over your lifespan. So the most extroverted 18-year-old probably is going to be close to being the most extroverted 90-year-old. That's rank order stability. I believe that's one of the best ways of looking at stability over the lifespan. A second way is to look at mean level stability, where you look at someone regardless of their age in terms of the population. So you look at the most extroverted people in a group, no matter how old they are. It's an interesting approach. It's easier than rank order stability, but it's not nearly as powerful. Now, this isn't quite stability, but I kind of shoehorned it in here. Personality coherence. Personality coherence is maintaining your rank order relative to others, the members of your cohort, but the behaviors manifested by your trait change over time. So you would imagine the 18-year-old swinging off of the chandelier at the party was probably the 8-year-old talking and getting in trouble in class, and the 90-year-old hustling up the shuffleboard game at the nursing home. Let's face it, 8-year-olds can't get up to swing on the chandelier yet. They're too small. And put your average 90-year-old swinging across the room on the chandelier, you'll probably kill them. So these things change over time, and personality coherence, I think, is a extremely useful tool for studying personality over the lifetime. Now, we also look at things, well, here's just another definition of personality coherence, sorry. The predictable changes or manifestations or outcomes in personality factors over time, even if the trait remains the same. So the trait remains the same, the behaviors change with age appropriately. And you've all heard the age-appropriate behavior kind of line. Maybe even had it used on you. I rarely act age-appropriate, but that's not your problem, that's mine. Well, let me show you one of my favorite studies ever done in personality psychology. Probably one of the most important studies, in my mind, in all of psychology. It was done by this guy. Except he had really dark hair when he did it a long time ago. It's a more recent picture. The lead author, Caspi, just an extremely creative, intelligent guy. I consider him one of the smartest guys in psychology. Caspi talks about a notion that is called cumulative continuity. And basically, cumulative continuity can be defined as the progressive effects of dispositionally guided selection and creation of environments. Kind of taking dispositionally guided selection is kind of very similar to Buss's selection that we've previously talked about in the PE Fit unit. We do things that are trait-based. Our traits guide us in a certain way. I really like Caspi's definition, dispositionally guided selection. It's got a really great ring to it. So basically what he's saying is that the effects of continually having certain personality traits add up over your lifetime. They accumulate and subsequently have important consequences. Now, to study this, Caspi used 3 interactional styles and the Berkeley Guidance Growth Study, Berkeley Longitudinal Aging Study samples. These people were born in the 1930s, came to age in the early 1950s, many of the men serving in the Korean conflict. They became the parents of the Happy Days generation of people, had their work careers through the 50s, 60s, and 70s. They're still following these people today. They've been measured with every psychological measurement you can give them. They've been interviewed by clinicians. They've done different groups. There are millions of pages of data, thousands of feet of tape, and all kinds of other data records on these people. And they're still following them up. There are ratings from their parents. It was originally a guidance and growth study to study the development of children, but they just kept on collecting data on these folks. And now that they're senior citizens, they're still collecting data, but along the way they've got data from their parents. They have data from their spouses, their children, other people in their lives. Major data set. Problem is, measures aren't consistent over time. We come up with new ideas. We come up with new tests. So it takes quite a bit of intestinal fortitude to be able to do this type of research. Caspi, Darrell Behm, Glenn Elder published these studies, a series of studies in the late 1980s on this. I'm going to highlight one. And they looked at 3 different ways that people interacted with the world. So there was a group of people who were ill-tempered. These are people who are characterized as moving against the world. There are shy people who are moving away from the world. And finally, the last group he studied were dependent people. These are people, he says, are moving towards the world. And my bad joke on them is they're people who need people. When we get to the results, you'll get to see if they are the luckiest people in the world. And if you know your old crooner like Frank Sinatra songs, you'll be able to figure out that lame joke. So, let me show you the study, for one part of the study about ill-tempered men. And this is a path analysis that was published in the paper. I'll give you some more general results, but I want you to see the paths here. So if you look here, you see all kinds of lines and arrows and boxes. The box on the bottom left here is number of temper tantrums when the man was a child. Then you have a box, education, and then occupational status, and then how erratic was the work life. Did you keep jobs for a long time, or were you constantly moving from job to job? The numbers in the paths are basically, can be interpreted as correlations. They're not quite correlations, but good enough for what we're talking about. The R-squares from the regressions are in the boxes there. So if you look along the bottom, you can see that the number of temper tantrums a child has predicts that how many temper tantrums they'll have as an adult, which basically works out to having an erratic work life. These people had trouble keeping a job. They were nasty, and they got fired a lot. They lost their jobs. They became quickly dissatisfied with jobs and left, things like that. But let's look at the other relationships in here. Let's look along the top. And as college students, carefully look at this one. Look at the path between education and occupational success in midlife. Got a 0.59 weight in there, or correlation between those two things. So the level of education you get is a strong predictor of the occupational status in midlife. And as you know, occupational status also affects income. Let me give you one of my favorite numbers. I think there should be a banner on this on every university in the Cal State system. The average, and this is a very old number, I haven't seen the new ones in a while, compared to non-college graduates in the state of California, individuals earning any kind of degree from the Cal State system will make on average over their work lives $29,000 more a year. That's a big difference. Stay in school, it's cool. Sorry, couldn't help myself. Let's look at these other paths. Temper tantrums do not predict levels of education. These people were hostile, and remember, they're all men. So they most likely dropped out of high school earlier. Well, the data shows they dropped out of high school earlier. They didn't generally get college education or advanced training. So you see, actually, there's a negative path there. Also notice a negative path between number of temper tantrums as a child and occupational status in midlife. That's a pretty profound number there. You wouldn't think that a kid's temper tantrum parlayed into occupational status. If you look at the other weights, the one from education to erratic work life, you see there's an insignificant relationship between education and erratic work life, but there is a negative correlation between erratic work life and occupational status in midlife. Now, many social psychologists will tell you the just world hypothesis doesn't work. Nasty people will win as much as good people will. I think this data clearly shows that nasty people suffer over the course of their lifetimes with less occupational status and lower incomes and erratic work lives. So, don't do that. Well, Caspi studied groups of individuals. Let's first talk about the ill-tempered men. And this guy looks fairly ill-tempered here. Here are some of the basic findings from the Caspi Women Elder Study. The ill-tempered men tended to terminate their formal educations earlier than the normative group. A lot of this was on the other flow chart. Their occupational status of the first job lower, and their occupational status decreased over the lifespan. Now, as I said, many of these men served in the military. The draft was still around. The Korean War was around. They generally achieved lower ranks than even-tempered males. Something not on the slide, they also had a higher frequency of dishonorable discharges. And one we just talked about, the death. They had erratic work lives. But another major finding is they had double the rate of divorce than the even-tempered males. Now, one of the things I find fascinating is the difference between each of these groups. Let's now look at the ill-tempered women. She is about the most ill-tempered woman's picture I could find on the web. Well, this is a generation where women tended to be stay-at-home moms. It's probably one of the last generations where that was widespread. So if you're ill-tempered as a young girl, you're going to be an ill-tempered mother. Their children and spouses rated them as less adequate than other even-tempered women. I love this finding. I think it's really cool. Ill-tempered women marry down in social economic status. Generally, most women marry at their social status or higher. The technical term for that is hypergamy. I also call it the Cinderella effect, where a poor woman can marry a rich guy and rise in status. Guys at the same social status as the ill-tempered women didn't see them as marriage material, and hence these women had to date guys below their SES level that they grew up in. They share the same characteristic with the men, having twice as many divorces. But as you remember, work history was a major factor for the ill-tempered guys, not for the ill-tempered women. Why? Probably due to historical effects. Now you have to remember, this was way before the feminist movement. And generally, women did not stay in the workforce. If they did, they were kind of siloed into a couple of professions: clerical work, teaching, and nursing. And what happened is many of the women in this cohort didn't have erratic work histories, because when they did get married, they did stop working and have their children and family and raise them, just as the even-tempered women did as well. So they didn't stay in the workforce for a significant chunk of time, which greatly affected the differences between men and women for this variable. Always remember, when you see sex differences, look for the root cause of it. And this one has to do with cohorts and historical things. It would be very interesting to replicate this study with a group of modern women who are in the workforce for significant chunks of their lives. Let's look at the two other interactional styles. We have shy guys, shy males. Remember earlier on when we were talking about age-graded transitions? Shy men married later in life. Took them a little while to work up the intestinal fortitude to ask a woman out. In that generation, people typically got married and then had their children, so they became fathers later in life. This is a big one economically for the shy guys. They started their stable long-term jobs at a much later point in their lives than the stable guys did, which affects salary, which affects retirement, and a whole lot of other things. Without any support to the correlations here, they have higher divorce rates. I'm speculating that they probably weren't really good at communicating with their partners and ended up getting divorced a lot. So, shy guys. Let's look at shy women. Well, in this generation, the shy women could select more domestic lifestyles. They could be the stay-at-home moms, and no one would think twice of it. They weren't off time in any of their tasks. They got married about the same time as the non-shy women and had children about the same time. Why? Again, cohort effects. And again, a big sex difference. At this time, the social rules generally were that men asked women out on dates. And so if there was a shy girl around that a guy was interested in, well, she got asked out and tended to move on with her life task at a relatively comparable rate to the normal women, or not the normal, the non-shy. Dependent males. As a very independent person, I kind of look at this one and think probably not a good thing, but this one surprises me. The shy guys are more likely to be on time than any other male group with their transitions. So I say shy meant dependent. They made normative role transitions. They went from being a student to worker to husband and father, grandfather, retiree, normatively. They had very stable marriages. So shy guys don't look that bad. I'm shy guys, dependent guys. Sorry. Dependent women, though. What's going on with the dependent women? Well, first of all, they have low aspiration rates, which means they didn't aspire to have careers and jobs. Why? They married earlier, had their kids earlier, so they were off time in a different way than the other groups. They did these things early. They looked for a guy to depend on as quickly as they could and then had kids with them. Because they were looking for someone to take care of them, they attained lower levels of formal education. And Caspi and his colleagues note that these women remained dependent over most of their lifespan. They were dependent on their parents as children. They were dependent on their spouses as wives. And later, as they moved into the golden years, they were dependent on their children. So Caspi shows the long-term effects of having personality traits add up. I think this is fascinating, great work. Let's look at some other areas of personality coherence over time. Kelly and Conley studied marital stability and satisfaction. They used a group of 300 couples who became engaged from a period of time from the 1930s to the 1980s. They also had friend ratings of the participants' personality traits for many different dimensions. Just give you a snapshot of the results for this study. 3 things predicted marital satisfaction and dissatisfaction and divorce. Neurotic husbands predicted marital dissatisfaction and divorce. Impulsive behavior by the husband, which can cost the family a lot of resources and things, led to dissatisfaction. And the wife's high levels of neuroticism predicted marital dissatisfaction. So, looking at this data, if you're young and looking for a spouse, find men who aren't impulsive or neurotic. If you're a woman looking for a guy, find one, or excuse me, if you're a guy looking for a woman, find one who's not neurotic. Okay, rank order stability in adulthood. Looking at many, many different studies of personality traits over the long term, there's broad to high levels of stability for the big personality traits. In fact, the average correlation of personality traits and scales over time is about 0.65. That's pretty high. So generally, we are fairly stable. This stability is found not only in self-reports, but in spouse reports and reports of other peers. And it turns that personality consistency tends to increase with age. And our personality, for the most part, becomes more plastered and set in stone over time. Now, for the big 5, personality traits are very consistent. After 50, there's very little change in an individual's average level of personality. And remember, we're talking about population stats. Any individual may change a whole lot. When you look at mean stable levels of stability in adults, you find changes during the 20s. Openness, extroversion, neuroticism decline until about 50 slightly. Conscientiousness and agreeableness increase over time and the lifespan. This is why your stereotypical senior citizen is very conscientious and organized and wants to get everything done. They are just more conscientious than they've ever been in their lives. And it's also why, at an extreme, senior citizens may be gullible because they're too agreeable over time. So that's a bit on personality over the lifespan. This table shows a series of different scales and their stability over time. They're kind of organized in terms of the big 5. So, go forth and be stable and consistent in your behavior. We'll see you next time in the personality psychology class. Bye now. This has been a We Have Couches video production. Copyright 2020, Professor Michael Gottlieb. All rights reserved.